Alright, welcome to another edition of what I've been calling my television addiction series, in which I go through and talk about all the TV shows I watched in 2011 and 2012 when I was living in Cambodia and was watching way too many DVDs. I've got a video which I'll link to in the description down below, and which I explain exactly what this series is and why I started doing it. But for today, I'm going to talk about Mad Men. Now, advanced warning on this. First of all, I don't really have anything intelligent to say about this series, so, feel free not to watch. And if you do continue watching, remember it's on you. I've given you fair warning. And secondly, this is going to be similar to the previous video I've posted. Previous video was talking about Breaking Bad and was largely an apology to fans of the show for my not getting interested in it. This is going to be similar. This is going to be something that I wouldn't say I wasn't interested in it. I was initially quite interested in it, but I didn't stick with it. And so this is going to be an apology for that and just talking about my experience watching the show. So as I said, the premise behind this series is talking about the TV shows I watched from 2011 to 2012. But Mad Men was actually a show that I had started watching my last couple years in Japan, 2009 or 2010, I believe. Now sorry, not 2010, 2009, my last year in Japan. It was one of those few American shows that became popular in Japan and that you could get the DVDs of. Sorry, I shouldn't say few American shows. There are many American shows that were popular in Japan, but it wasn't all of them by any stretch. And back in those days, my primary way of keeping track of American television was just going to the DVD rental store in Japan and watching those American TV shows which you could rent in Japan. And it was not all of them by any means, but there were some American TV shows that had an audience in Japan, and Mad Men was one of them, so I could rent the DVDs when I was living in Japan. And I initially checked it out just because everyone was talking about it, and because I was in Japan, I got a bit of a delayed release there, so I could hear the hype long before the DVDs hit the shelves in Japan. But once they did, I thought, all right, this is what everyone's been talking about, and I checked it out, and yeah, that first season has a lot of hooks in it, and yeah, let's talk about that. Let's talk about what made the show so appealing. So I think the initial thing was it was a period piece which seemed to be very authentic. Now, I say seemed to be because I didn't actually live through the early 1960s myself, nor have I extensively researched the period. I mean, I'm a bit of I like retro stuff. So, old movies, old TV shows, etc., stuff like that. But I've not really done extensive research on it. But that caveat aside, it certainly felt very authentic. I've complained before on this channel about how some retro movies or projects like X-Men First Class seem to be confusing the fashion from the late 60s with the early 60s. But Mad Men seemed to have its period details down. This was the early 60s, this was not the late 60s, and they knew it. And the fashion, the haircuts, the feel of that office all just looked like it was from the early 60s. And again, I'm basing this just off of old TV shows and all old movies I've seen. I'm no expert myself, but it certainly felt very authentic. And it also immersed you into this world of kind of highly successful early 1960s businessmen. And I had, at that point in my life, I was in my late 20s, had up until that point really never given much thought to the life of a businessman. I mean, I had been more attracted in my youth to the lifestyle of the hippies, etc., the rebels, the underground scene. But, you watch this episode, you watch this first season of Mad Men, right from the first episode, you get drawn in and you think, oh yeah, how cool it would be to be a businessman like that. I mean, it really just, and, like all good television, it's a fantasy. I mean, it's a fantasy life of what a businessman's life would be. Everyone's good looking and everyone's having witty conversations, etc. I say that now, but it took me some time to realize that this was a fantasy. My initial reaction watching this is, oh, this is just so authentic about what it's like watching a documentary. And that, I think, well, part of that is maybe I'm just stupid. And it took me a while to realize it was a fantasy. But maybe there are a few other people who also got pulled into that. And I think part of that is it was just such an immersive environment. And they again, those period details, they seem to have down so pat. And they presented a world which was misogynist. But then, of course, it was the early 60s, so you could believe that, it was before the feminist revolution, right? So back in those days, weren't all businessmen misogynists? Now, since I've seen the initial few episodes and got completely pulled into that world, I have read some critical pieces on it. I think you can find those links on Wikipedia, if memory serves. It's been a while since I checked it, truth be told. Anyways, you can find some critical pieces in which people were pushing back on how authentic the misogyny was. And they said, well, okay, women didn't get hired to executives, but you still had to treat them with some respect. They said if people had shown that kind of disrespect to women like these people are portrayed as showing in Mad Men, they've just been shown the door of the company. That that behavior wouldn't have been tolerated back then. The other thing, which was part of this fantasy, in addition to the presentation of misogyny. Oh, sorry. I should make this perfectly clear. I suspect this is already clear to most people who are familiar with this series, but just in case it isn't, I should make this perfectly clear. The creator's intention was not to endorse this misogyny. The creator's intention was to kind of show how attitudes are changing throughout the 60s. So at the first season, which takes place, I believe, in 1960, it's supposed to show how backwards thinking these men were, so that the later episodes will make it clear how women's rights, and later episodes and later seasons will make it clear how the change in attitudes is progressing as the 1960s progresses. So it's not in any sense meant to endorse misogyny. Well, I mention that because it strikes me I'm using maybe the wrong choice of words when I say part of the fantasy. But I think the misogyny is part of the period setting, which is kind of creating, which is part of the immersiveness, is you think it's period authentic. But what is part of the fantasy, definitely, is the drinking. So this series shows these businessmen who always have the liquor in the cabinet. And, they show up and they pour themselves a shot and they take the shot. Or, they come in for a 10 o'clock meeting and they pour everyone drinks. And again, it seems to be very period authentic, right? Because we have this image of everyone was a hard drinker back then. And, old movies and stuff like that. Where and just the whole image about how the businessmen back in those days would take a couple hard drinks to relax in the evening. But this kind of constant drinking all through the day was new to me, but I completely bought into it as part of the fantasy. And in fact, although I'm somewhat embarrassed to admit it, that last year I was living in Japan, it had somewhat of an impact on me. When I went to the bar, I wouldn't order a beer. I would order one of those drinks that I heard about on Mad Men. I would order like a martini or something. Because, I don't know, I just had this image of it being really sophisticated. I'm embarrassing myself. I should also mention my friends were laughing at me at the time because I always dressed like a slob. Yeah, not at work necessarily, but when I went out, I would just, similar to how I'm dressed now, I guess. You know, just a t-shirt, shorts, sandals, and they said you can't drink a martini dressed like that. And you know, as soon as they said it, I thought, oh yeah, I guess this is a bit incongruous. But it was something that didn't initially hit me at first because I can't see how I look. I mean, I'm dressed like a slob, but my eyes are focused out this way looking at everyone else. So sometimes I just forget how ridiculous I look. If you forget how ridiculous you look, it's easy to think that you can be sophisticated with just a sophisticated drink in your hand until your friends laugh at you and point it out to you. But yeah, I suspect I'm not the only one. In fact, I've heard tales anecdotally, and some even in published media, columnists writing about this, about how people who watch a lot of Mad Men will get the urge to dress up in, you know, a suit and tie and go to the bar and order kind of hard drinks and then kind of complain about how nobody is sophisticated anymore, or, you know, we've lost that sophistication. Because the idea of these madmen in their suits and their ties drinking this alcohol, looking so sophisticated. And I think a couple other shows have taken this cue since then. Some other shows maybe I'll talk about in later videos. The one that springs to mind is The Hour, which is a British show, which also seems to have taken this idea of people in the old times wearing suits and ties and looking sophisticated and drinking a lot of hard alcohol, which I heavily suspect was influenced by the Mad Men aesthetic. Yeah, it's something I admit with some reluctance, because I don't like to admit that I'm so easily influenced by the media, especially because as a child and teenager, I used to have this long-running debate with my mother about how impressionable I was to the media. So like my mother wouldn't let me watch all the other shows that the kids were watching. I couldn't watch Tom and Jerry because it was too violent, and my mother was worried it was going to make an impression on me. And, you know, later I couldn't watch Terminator, or I couldn't watch Terminator 2, which was the big movie one summer when I was in middle school, which everybody else at my, you know, school saw except me, or so it seemed at the time. So I adopted this position contrary to my mother, that the entertainment is entertainment and real life is real life, and I'm perfectly capable of telling the difference. And I'm not going to become violent just because I'm watching the Terminator movies. But it is, you know, to give credence to the other part of the argument where it's due. Media does influence us, doesn't it, sometimes? And that whole Mad Men popularity, I think, did have a influence on culture where people were ordering more hard drinks or trying to look more sophisticated or trying to emulate these characters. And of course, it was all complete fantasy, what we saw in the Mad Men TV show. And it took me a while to realize this. But, you know, eventually, again, articles began coming out that were critical of the authenticity of how much these guys were drinking all through the day. Somebody said, you know, you can't drink that much brown liquid all day and still look as slim and handsome as those guys do. If you're drinking that much alcohol through the day, you're going to look bloated and splotchy skin and stuff like that. I don't know. Ironic, isn't it, that the whole show is about advertising, right? Because that's the classic thing with advertising is you have all these super attractive people drinking stuff like Coca-Cola and beer and cigarettes and other things which actually do not make you super attractive if you consume them in large amounts. Or perhaps that's the point. Perhaps that was intended all along. Anyways, I'm rambling here, I know. The first season got its hooks into me early, and I watched it. And you had a feeling of watching something that was very well done, with writers that you thought that you knew what they were doing. You trusted that the storylines were heading towards somewhere important. It did move painfully slow, though, didn't it? It really required patience. But then that patience was all that atmosphere and getting to know those characters then resulted in the dramatic turns having more dramatic payoff. So when I watched season 1 in Japan, then I was in Australia for a year, and then when I was back in Cambodia, when I went to Cambodia and had access to all those DVDs, I started watching them, although once again I'm afraid I watched them a bit out of order just because I was so eager to get back into the show that I just picked up the most recent box set, which I think was season 4 maybe, and skipped season 2 or 3 but came back to them later. I remember asking my friend, I said, what happened to Sal? He had been such a big guy and as a main character in the first season. And all of a sudden by season 4 he was gone, he was out of the show. And my friend filled me in and said, oh, there was some sort of gay scandal that happened in season 3 that resulted in him getting fired. And my friend also said, you're a complete idiot, why are you watching these out of order? You need to watch them in order, just like a novel. This was the same friend who gave me a rough time about having attempted to watch Breaking Bad out of order. So he was losing his patience by this time when he heard I was watching parts of Mad Men out of order. And he's right. Kind of the slow burn that this series is, really, if you're not going to watch it in order, what's the point? I regret to say, and again, this is partially because I watched it out of order, but I suspect this would be true even if I watched it in order. I didn't really have the patience for it. And I know that's on me. You know, that's not a diss on this show. I'm sure the show is brilliant. I just didn't have the patience for it. And again, this was at a time when I had access to just all these cheap DVDs in Cambodia. And so you can, when there's so many other options of so much other TV that is more fast-paced and that will cater to a shorter attention span, it's difficult to really get into a slower show like Mad Men when you have those other alternatives just sitting by. But the other thing is, I think Mad Men is a difficult show to binge watch. If you're watching it in real time when it was coming out, week by week, then I think that's okay. But it's a show that it's really difficult to sit through like 3 hours of Mad Men or like a week of binging Mad Men. The same way you might binge watch some of these other shows. Like I mentioned, Arrested Development or Deadwood or something like that, shows that were very addictive. Whereas Mad Men, it was well done, but I didn't find it addictive in a binge watching sense. I felt like it was really hard to get into when I was watching it that way. So I ended up giving up on it, partly because I was watching it out of order, and partly because I didn't have the patience for it, and partly because I don't think it's best watched as binge watched. So So apologies to the fans of the show. I'm told it ended brilliantly with that whole Coca-Cola commercial thing and everything like that. Which, yeah, that Coca-Cola commercial is actually something I mentioned in a previous video when I was talking about Me Talk Pretty One Day by David Sedaris, which was the first time I realized that that song had originated as a Coca-Cola commercial. And ever since then, it's been one of my favorite factoids. So when I heard that Mad Men had incorporated that into their final episode, I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. I've always kind of been interested in that, the cultural relevance that that commercial has had. And it was a cool way to tie in advertising and culture and how counterculture and advertising had a symbiotic relationship, which is actually something I remember my college professor talking about. I took a course on modern American history, and she was talking about the 1960s and the counterculture. And I remember my professor saying, and this was, like a decade before Mad Men even came out. This was back in the 90s. Professor was talking about how the advertisers were latching onto the counterculture trends. And she said this is part of the reason that counterculture in the 1960s didn't really take off, is because it was so easily imitated by advertisers. And then, of course, as soon as Coca-Cola and everybody is doing it, it's no longer cool anymore to the people who are seeking a true alternative culture. I'm paraphrasing what my professor said years ago, but point being, this was something that years ago I had learned about in college, is the symbiotic relationship, or the parasitic relationship maybe, between advertisers and counterculture in the 1960s. And I'm told that Mad Men did a very good job of integrating those themes into its later seasons, and especially with its final episode. Sorry, I know I'm rambling, but I did warn you at the beginning of the video that I wouldn't have much intelligent to say about this, right? Okay, I'm just going to call this quits here.